Long before the first brush of ink met bamboo, before dragons danced across porcelain, there was only the river, vast, unpredictable, golden with silt and memory. The Huanghe, or Yellow River, surged through the northern plains of what we now call China. It did not whisper, it roared, it flooded, destroyed, then nourished. It was both womb and warrior, and from its restless waters, a civilization stirred. More than 5,000 years ago, long before China became an empire, people gathered along the river's edge. They planted millet in the loess soil. They carved homes into cliffs. They shaped pottery with spirals and painted symbols not yet understood. This was the Neolithic era, and cultures like Yangshao and Longshan laid the first stones of what would become one of humanity's most enduring civilizations. But it was not just tools or crops that made them remarkable. It was memory. These early people did not merely survive, they remembered. They passed stories through generations, of floods that swallowed villages, and of legendary figures who rose to tame them. Among these was a name whispered for millennia: Yu the Great. He was not a god, though myth would lift him into the heavens. He was not a king by birth, but by deed. As the tales go, when floods consumed the land, drowning harvests and homes, Yu did not build walls to block the waters. He studied them. He dug channels. He diverted the rivers with patience and skill. For 13 years, he labored, not with soldiers, but with soil. And when the floods receded, the people declared him not just a hero, but a sage king. Thus began the legendary Xia Dynasty, China's first, veiled in both history and myth. It marked the moment when humans no longer merely endured nature, but organized against it. Kingship emerged. Rituals were codified. Society began to stratify. The mandate of heaven, though not yet named, was being born in the minds of men. But history's first true chapter in China begins more clearly with the Xia Dynasty, around 1600 BCE. Here, civilization burst into clarity. The Shang people built walled cities of rammed earth. They raised palaces and altars. They worshipped ancestor spirits, believing the dead could intervene in the affairs of the living. And so, they sought guidance through oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox scapulas, inscribed with early Chinese characters, then cracked with fire to read the divine will. These bones are not just artifacts. They are voices, the oldest written records of China, questions etched into bone. Will the harvest fail? Will my son recover? Should we go to war? The writing was already complex, the system already vast. It didn't evolve from scribbles. It emerged, fully formed, as if memory had sharpened itself into language. A script that, in various forms, still lives today. The Shang were masters of bronze. Their artisans cast ritual vessels of astonishing intricacy, not for trade, but for offerings. Bronze was sacred, a bridge between the earthly and the ancestral. They raised massive cauldrons adorned with teoti, mythical faces of beasts, perhaps to protect, perhaps to frighten. And behind this spiritual life was hierarchy. A powerful king, warrior nobles, artisans, farmers, slaves. Society was ordered like the cosmos, layered, rhythmic, Unyielding, the king was not just ruler, he was medium, the one who spoke for the living and the dead. But power, like a river, flows, and sometimes floods. Around 1046 BCE, a new force rose in the west, the Zhou. Claiming that the Shang had lost virtue, the Zhou kings introduced a powerful idea, one that would echo through Chinese history for centuries. The mandate of heaven. Heaven, they declared, was not a god, but a moral force. It granted rule not by blood, but by righteousness. A just king kept harmony between earth and sky. A corrupt one would lose the mandate, and with it, the throne. Dynasties would rise and fall, but the concept would endure, shaping China's political philosophy forever. Under the Zhou, the land expanded. Feudal lords governed distant provinces. Ritual and etiquette blossomed. But over centuries, power fragmented. The central Zhou king became symbolic, and the lords became kings in all but name. The age of unity dissolved into an age of strife. This would lead, eventually, to the Warring States period, a time of chaos, but also of genius. But that is a story for another part. For now, we return to the beginning, to the river, still winding, still restless. Why did civilization begin here? Because in the Yellow River Valley, life demanded both strength and subtlety. Floods taught engineering. Crops demanded planning. Spirits called for reverence. And the harshness of nature required both cooperation and authority. Here, people farmed and fought, worshipped and wrote, built and remembered. Here, in the cradle of silt and sky, China did not merely arise, it awakened. And though dynasties would come and go, though philosophies would clash and empires rise, the echoes of that awakening would remain in the bones, in the bronzes, in the brush strokes. Because to understand China is to understand its river, endlessly flowing, silently shaping, carrying not just water, but the weight of a civilization. In the vast theater of Chinese history, emperors were not merely rulers. They were chosen by heaven, not born to power, but entrusted with it. And if they ruled unjustly, that mandate could be revoked, not by rebellion alone, but by the will of the cosmos itself. This idea, the mandate of heaven, was not just a myth or metaphor. It was a moral contract, written not on paper, but in thunder and famine, in flood and rebellion. It was the heartbeat of Chinese political philosophy for over 2,000 years. It began with the Zhou Dynasty. Around 1046 BCE, King Wu of Zhou overthrew the Shang, claiming that heaven had abandoned the corrupt Shang rulers. The Zhou kings proclaimed themselves sons of heaven, not divine, but divinely guided. Their right to rule, they said, depended on virtue, not blood. They brought with them a new political structure, a feudal system, where local lords governed territories in exchange for loyalty and military service. For the first few centuries, the Zhou rule held strong. Rituals were formalized. Ancestor worship deepened. The concept of lai, proper conduct, governed both court and family. Harmony, order, and hierarchy became sacred values. But slowly, the unity frayed. Feudal lords grew powerful and distant. The Zhou kings, once supreme, became figureheads. By the 8th century BCE, the dynasty split into two eras. The Western Zhou, centered at Haojing, and the Eastern Zhou, after the capital was moved east to Luoyang following invasions. And then began the spring and autumn period, named not for seasons, but for the chronicled annals of the state of Lu. It was an age of diplomacy and deception, of shifting alliances and countless wars. Over 170 small states existed, vying for dominance. But it was also a time of great intellectual blossoming, a paradox that would shape China forever. Out of the chaos rose the 100 schools of thought. Thinkers wandered from court to court, offering rulers advice, not just on war, but on virtue, statecraft, law, and the cosmos. Among them stood Confucius, whose vision of moral government would define Chinese civilization for centuries. He taught that a ruler must be a moral example, that society should be governed by ritual, respect, and responsibility, not by force, but by virtue. Others followed. Laozi, speaking of the Tao, the way that flows beneath all things. Mozi, who preached universal love. Legalists, who believed in strict law and order. Zhuangzi, who laughed at logic and danced with paradox. Ideas clashed as often as armies. By the 5th century BCE, the Warring States period had begun. 7 major states remained: Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei. They built massive fortifications, raised vast armies, and refined bureaucracies. Warfare became scientific. Swords were forged from iron. Diplomats became spies. Kings became emperors in all but name. And yet, out of this blood and brilliance, something new was forged. Imperial China. It was the Qin state, under the leadership of Ying Zheng, that finally conquered all rivals by 221 BCE. He took a new name, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. But his rule was not Confucian. It was legalist, strict, centralized, absolute. He standardized weights and measures, coins and roads, writing systems and axle widths. He built the early Great Wall, not as a monument, but as a defense. He burned books and buried scholars to silence dissent. He dreamed of immortality and had an army of 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors buried with him, guardians for eternity. Yet even he could not defy time. He died in 210 BCE, and his empire collapsed within years. The Qin had unified China, but ruled without compassion. Heaven, it seemed, had withdrawn its favor. Out of the ashes rose the Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, a commoner turned emperor. He restored Confucian ideals, tempered legalist strictness, and expanded the empire through both diplomacy and war. Under the Han, China flourished. The Silk Road was opened, connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and even Rome. Trade boomed. Science and literature advanced. Confucianism was institutionalized, not just as philosophy, but as state doctrine. To serve in government, one had to pass exams rooted in the classics. Thus began the world's first merit-based bureaucracy. The Han ruled for over 4 centuries. But again, wealth bred corruption. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few. Rebellions rose, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, fueled by hunger and injustice. Warlords carved the empire into pieces. By 220 CE, the Han fell. China entered a period of division. The 3 kingdoms, then the 6 dynasties, then the northern and southern dynasties. Yet through every collapse, the mandate of heaven endured. Every new dynasty claimed it. Every failed one was said to have lost it. Because for the Chinese people, history was not a line. It was a cycle. Rise, flourish, decline, fall, and begin again. Like the seasons, like the river, the empire moved in rhythm. It was not chaos. It was order misunderstood. In time, China would rise again, under the Sui, the Tang, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing. Each dynasty would bring triumph and tragedy, light and shadow. But behind each was a singular thread, that the ruler must serve not himself, but heaven and the people. That justice must prevail, or power would not. This was the mandate of heaven, not a crown, not a sword, but a principle, as fragile as trust, and as powerful as faith. In a time when swords clashed more than voices, when warlords carved China into fragments, and rulers rose and fell like the turning of leaves, a single man wandered from state to state, not to conquer, but to teach. He carried no army. He wore no crown. He held no wealth. And yet, his words would outlast emperors, outlive dynasties, and reshape the soul of a civilization. His name was Kongqu, later honored as Confucius, born in 551 BCE. During the turbulent spring and autumn period, Confucius was raised in the small state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province. His family was noble by blood, but poor in fortune. His father died when he was young, and his mother taught him discipline, respect, and love for learning. From an early age, he displayed a hunger not just for knowledge, but for meaning, for a moral compass in a world spinning out of control. He watched the states of China tear each other apart, petty kings waging endless war, ministers chasing power, rituals hollowed of spirit. The old Zhou order was collapsing. Harmony, he, as the Chinese called it, had been lost. Confucius didn't dream of escape. He dreamed of restoration. He believed that humanity could return to balance, not through force, but through virtue. He believed that a ruler must be more than a figure of authority. He must be a model of morality, that a society was only as strong as its character. And so he began to teach, not in temples, but under trees, not in royal halls, but in dusty courtyards. He gathered disciples, men of all backgrounds, and taught them not what to think, but how to live. He spoke of 5 central relationships: ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend. These were not power structures, but networks of responsibility. Each came with a duty. Each demanded respect. And through these relationships, society could rebuild itself. One ritual, one gesture, one word at a time. His central virtue was Ren, often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or compassion. To Confucius, Ren was the inner goodness that connected all people. It was not enough to follow laws. One must act with empathy. It was not enough to honor parents. One must love them. He taught Li, ritual, not as empty ceremony, but as the shape of respect. From the way one bowed to the way one spoke, every action could become sacred if done with sincerity. He believed in Xiao, filial piety. In honoring one's ancestors, a person remembered their place in the great chain of time. He taught that the superior man, the Junzi, was not noble by birth, but by character. He was patient, just, humble, self-reflective, and most of all, he sought harmony in his family, his state, and his soul. But Confucius was not naive. He knew that warlords would not change overnight. He walked from court to court, offering his counsel to kings, pleading for reforms rooted in morality, not manipulation. Most dismissed him, some mocked him, others feared him. He was, after all, a revolutionary, one who wielded virtue like a sword. Towards the end of his life, disillusioned but not bitter, he returned to Lu. He compiled and edited ancient texts, the Book of Songs, the Book of Rites, the Book of Documents. He preserved the wisdom of the past, hoping it would guide the future. When he died in 479 BCE, few could have guessed that his ideas would one day become the foundation of the Chinese state, the bedrock of its bureaucracy, the pulse of its culture. It was only in later dynasties, particularly the Han, that Confucianism was enshrined as state orthodoxy. The civil service exams, through which officials were selected, were rooted in Confucian texts. For over 1,000 years, scholars memorized his analects, debated his meanings, and tried to live his teachings. Confucius had succeeded in what emperors had often failed. He had unified China's mind and heart. His philosophy became not only ethics, but education, not only tradition, but transformation. Through Confucianism, China came to value order, respect, family, duty, and education, not as abstract ideals, but as daily practices. Yet Confucianism was not without critics. Taoists saw it as too rigid. Buddhists later challenged its focus on the external world. And during times of stagnation, some saw Confucian values as a burden, reinforcing hierarchy and stifling innovation. But Confucius never asked for blind obedience. He once said, "When the way is followed, speak boldly. When it is lost, act with courage." And so, his greatest legacy may not be the doctrines attributed to him, but the spirit in which he taught. that every person, no matter their station, could strive for goodness. That morality was not inherited, but cultivated. That society, like the individual, must always seek balance between tradition and progress, between duty and compassion. Even today, in classrooms, temples, and family altars, Confucius lives on, not as a prophet, not as a god, but as a teacher, a man who believed that peace was possible, not through power, but through example, that the world could be repaired, not by revolution, but by ritual and love, and that the greatest strength of a civilization was not its armies, but its virtue. In the vast currents of ancient China, two streams flowed, side by side, seemingly opposite, yet deeply intertwined. One was soft as mist, gentle as a falling leaf. The other was sharp as steel, precise as an arrow in flight. One whispered of harmony with nature, of letting go. The other spoke of strategy, of discipline, of winning without battle. Their names were Laozi and Sun Tzu, and between them, they carved a philosophy that would shape not only China, but the world in an age of war and ambition, where states rose and fell like passing storms. A quiet man, perhaps more legend than fact, rode west on a water buffalo. He was said to be old, with eyes that had seen too much of the world. His name was Laozi, the old master. According to tradition, he served as a court archivist in the Xia Dynasty. But disillusioned by corruption and conflict, he chose to leave civilization behind. At the western gate, a guard recognized him and begged, "Before you vanish, write down what you know." And so, in a few thousand characters, Laozi poured out his soul, a small book of deep paradoxes called the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and virtue. It began with mystery. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao, the way, is not a god, nor a doctrine. It is the underlying rhythm of all existence. It is the stream flowing through all things, not something to conquer, but to yield to. Laozi taught that softness overcomes hardness, that non-action, wu wei, effortless action, is the highest wisdom, that power lies in stillness, and leadership in humility. He wrote, "The best leaders are like water. They nourish all, dwell in low places, and contend with none." To the world of warlords and schemers, this was madness or enlightenment. Laozi didn't seek to reform the world through law or order, but to return it to balance. To him, society's obsession with control and conquest had separated people from the natural flow of life. The more laws one made, the more criminals appeared. The more weapons one forged, the more danger followed. And yet, even as Laozi spoke of yielding, another voice, equally ancient, spoke of discipline, clarity, and strategic force. That voice belonged to Sun Tzu, author of The Art of War, Bingfa, a timeless treatise on military strategy composed during the Warring States period, when chaos reigned and survival demanded more than virtue. But Sun Tzu was not a warmonger. He was a philosopher of war, a tactician of the mind. His first lesson was shocking. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. To Sun Tzu, deception, timing, and psychology mattered more than brute force. A true general wins before the battle even begins. He knows the terrain, the enemy, the mood of the troops, and, most importantly, himself. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. He viewed warfare as natural, even mathematical. Seasons mattered. Morale mattered. Appear weak when strong, strong when weak. Move like thunder, strike like wind. And when victory is uncertain, do not fight. To him, war was not glorious. It was a last resort. At first glance, Laozi and Sun Tzu seemed to walk separate paths. One toward the mountain mist, the other toward the battlefield. But in truth, they both saw the world through the lens of balance. Both understood nature's cycles. Both warned against hubris. Both taught that true strength comes not from force, but from alignment with time, with place, with self. Laozi said, "He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened." Sun Tzu said, "He who excels at resolving difficulties does so before they arise." One speaks from the mountain, the other from the camp, but they meet in the same truth. Victory is not domination, it is harmony. Their ideas would ripple through dynasties. Taoism, the spiritual path drawn from Laozi's thought, became one of China's major traditions. It evolved into a mystical practice of meditation, alchemy, breath control, and the pursuit of immortality. Its temples nestled in mountains, its adepts sought the inner elixir, and its ethics emphasized simplicity, spontaneity, and inner peace. Meanwhile, Sun Tzu's Art of War became a manual for rulers and generals, not just in China, but across the world. From Japanese samurai to Napoleonic strategists, from Wall Street executives to sports coaches, his principles endured. Yet in Chinese history, neither Taoism nor military doctrine stood alone. They existed in dynamic tension with Confucianism, which emphasized duty, structure, and ritual. The three traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism or strategy, became a tripod of thought, holding up the vast complexity of Chinese civilization. Confucius taught, "Be righteous." Laozi whispered, "Be still." Sun Tzu advised, "Be wise." Each offered a lens, not a law, because China, in its deepest wisdom, never sought one answer, but the balance of many. And so, even today, when one feels torn between force and surrender, structure and flow, struggle and retreat, the voices of Laozi and Sun Tzu still echo. In quiet moments, you may hear the Tao. Be like water. In moments of challenge, you may hear the general's whisper. Win without fighting. Together, they remind us that the strongest path is often the gentlest, that the deepest wisdom is often the quietest, and that to truly master the world, one must first master oneself. Before the unification, there was only chaos. For centuries, the warring states tore the Chinese land apart. 7 great kingdoms, hundreds of battles, endless schemes. The dream of unity had long become a fantasy, a whisper in the ruins of the Zhou, until one man, relentless, ruthless, and unmatched in ambition, turned that dream into an empire. His name was Ying Zheng, his title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. He was not born to peace, but to power. At 13, he became king of Qin. By 38, he had conquered all rival states. And by 40, he had declared a title never before heard in China, Huangdi, Emperor, uniting the lands from the Yellow River to the Pearl River Delta, under one throne, one law, one name. This was 221 BCE, the birth of Imperial China. But unity, as he envisioned it, came not through harmony. It came through order, strict, unyielding, absolute. The Qin Dynasty may have been short-lived, but its impact was eternal. Ying Zheng knew that to control such a vast and diverse realm, he could not rely on tradition, family, or feudal loyalty. He turned instead to the legalist philosophy, a school of thought that believed human nature was selfish, and only strict laws, standardized systems, and centralized control could maintain order. Under his chancellor, Li Si, sweeping reforms were enacted. Writing was standardized. No longer would different regions use different scripts. All across the empire, scribes would now write the same characters. Currency was unified. Round bronze coins with square holes became the empire's standard. Weights and measures were made uniform, ensuring fair trade and tax collection. Axle lengths were standardized so that all carts could travel on the same roads without conflict. The emperor ordered the construction of massive roads, thousands of kilometers connecting the empire like veins. He restructured the territories into administrative districts, ruled not by noble blood, but by officials loyal to the central government. He abolished the feudal system. Nobles were stripped of hereditary power. Authority now flowed from one source, the emperor himself. But unification came at a cost. Dissent was not tolerated. Confucianism, with its talk of virtue, moral rule, and questioning authority, was seen as dangerous. The infamous book Burnings began. Texts that challenged the regime were destroyed. Scholars who resisted were buried alive. Fear became the mortar of empire. Yet the emperor believed it was necessary. To him, the chaos of the past could only be held back by walls, real and symbolic. And so he built them. Across the northern frontier, he connected and expanded existing fortifications into a massive line of defense, what would become the Great Wall of China, built by forced labor, soldiers, peasants, prisoners. It stretched for thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and plains. A barrier against the nomadic Xiongnu, and a statement of imperial might. But even that wall would not be his greatest monument. In death, he sought eternity. He ordered the construction of a mausoleum unlike anything the world had ever seen. Beneath the hills of Lishan, craftsmen labored for decades to create an underground palace, a model of the empire he ruled, guarded by an army of clay. More than 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldiers, each unique, each sculpted with distinct faces, armor, and weapons. Archers, infantry, generals, horses, chariots, all buried with the emperor to protect him in the afterlife. It was not just a tomb. It was a vision of imperial eternity. The air in those pits is still heavy with silence. The silence of loyalty carved in clay. But even as the emperor built to last forever, his empire began to crack. Harsh rule breeds resentment. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and cruelty fed rebellion. When Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, after consuming mercury elixirs in pursuit of immortality, the empire lost its iron grip. His son lacked the will, the strength, and the legitimacy to hold power. Within 3 years, the Qin dynasty collapsed. Peasant uprisings erupted. Generals turned. Palaces burned. The man who united China had ruled for only 15 years. And yet, he changed everything. The idea of China as one empire, governed from the center, with standard laws, roads, currency, and script. That was his legacy. Every dynasty that followed built on what the Qin had laid down. Even the name China is believed to be derived from Qin, a short-lived dynasty, but one that gave identity to a vast civilization. Was he a tyrant? A visionary? Perhaps both. He ruled with fear, but also with foresight. He silenced opposition, but unified a fractured land. He destroyed old traditions, but created new foundations. His wall still stands. His army still watches. His empire, though gone, still echoes. In his pursuit of permanence, Qin Shi Huang left behind a question that echoes through the halls of history. Is it better to be loved or to be obeyed? He chose the latter. History remembers both. When the dust of the Qin dynasty settled, it left behind a broken empire, but also a foundation. From its ruins, a new force would rise, not with the iron fist of legalism, but with the vision of balance. That force was the Han Dynasty, and under its banner, China would flourish like never before. It began with a farmer, Liu Bang, once a low-ranking Qin official of peasant origin, led a rebellion against the Qin tyranny. Shrewd, charismatic, and pragmatic, he defeated rival warlords and established the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, becoming Emperor Gaozu. He was not a philosopher. He did not dream of immortality or clay armies. But he knew one essential truth. To govern a vast land, one must win the people's trust. And so, the Han returned to Confucian values: virtue over fear, order through morality, and merit over bloodline. The government restructured itself, not around noble families, but scholars. The seeds of civil service were planted. Officials would be selected not by birth, but by knowledge of the Confucian classics. It was a quiet revolution, and a lasting one. But the Han were not only thinkers. They were builders, explorers, and scientists. Under Emperor Wu, Han Wudi, who reigned for over 5 decades, 141-87 BCE, the dynasty expanded its territory far beyond the Yellow River Valley, deep into modern Vietnam, Korea, and the western deserts. Yet his most daring move was westward, into the unknown. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu dispatched a young envoy named Zhang Qian to seek alliances against nomadic Xiongnu tribes. Captured and imprisoned, Zhang spent over a decade in foreign lands. But he returned, not with armies, but with something greater: knowledge. He spoke of Fergana horses, grapes, glassware, and lands beyond imagination. Places that would one day be called Persia, India, even Rome. Thus was born the Silk Road. Not a single road, but a vast network of trade routes that would stretch from Chang'an to the Mediterranean, linking China to the west. From China flowed silk, jade, paper, ceramics, and lacquerware. From the west came gold, glass, wool, spices, and new ideas. Merchants braved deserts, mountains, and bandits. Caravans moved through oasis cities, carrying not just goods, but stories, beliefs, and diplomacy. Along the Silk Roads, civilizations met, not through war, but through exchange. And within China, prosperity bloomed. Cities expanded, markets buzzed, temples rose, arts flourished. The Han court supported science and invention with unusual enthusiasm. The great polymath Zhang Heng invented the seismoscope, the world's first device to detect earthquakes, using a delicate bronze vessel and dragon heads that dropped balls to indicate direction. Astronomy advanced. Han scholars charted the stars, predicted eclipses, and argued that the Earth was round. Mathematics developed place value notation and early forms of algebra. Medicine grew with the study of acupuncture, herbal therapy, and pulse diagnosis. But perhaps the greatest innovation came not from a scholar, but a humble court eunuch named Kai Lun. In 105 CE, he refined a technique that would change the world: the creation of paper from mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and water. Cheaper and easier to produce than bamboo slips or silk scrolls, paper would revolutionize administration, literature, and eventually education. The written word, once a privilege of elites, could now flow more freely. Knowledge could spread. Memory could last. Yet amid this golden age, shadows stirred. Court politics became entangled with eunuchs and empress dowagers. Land ownership grew unequal. Wealthy elites consumed resources while peasants suffered. Corruption festered behind Confucian rhetoric. Then came natural disasters, droughts, floods, locusts. To the people, these were not just misfortunes, they were signs from heaven. And when heaven is displeased, so too is the mandate. In 184 CE, a massive peasant rebellion erupted, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, inspired by mystical Taoist beliefs. It was crushed, but the dynasty never recovered its strength. Warlords rose again. The empire fractured. By 220 CE, the Han Dynasty, which had ruled for over 4 centuries, came to an end. China was divided once more. Yet even in its fall, the Han left a legacy that would echo across time. It established the Confucian state. It opened the Silk Roads that connected East and West. It developed paper, seismology, astronomy, and medicine. It cemented the identity of Han Chinese, an identity still held by the majority of China's population today. To this day, the name Han is used in language, ethnicity, and pride. The Han did not conquer time. No dynasty does. But they captured a moment when learning, trade, and order flowed together like rivers into an ocean. Their greatness was not in walls or armies, but in their ability to connect minds, markets, and heavens, from the courts of Chang'an to the sands of Samarkand, from the brush of the calligrapher to the compass of the explorer. The Han spirit endures, and in that spirit, the Silk Road still winds, in memory, in story, and in the unseen threads that bind our world together. Across the centuries, empires rose and fell, armies marched, walls crumbled, dynasties withered like old leaves. But while thrones were lost to time, ideas endured, and some ideas would change the world forever. Among the greatest legacies of ancient China are 4 extraordinary gifts to humanity, not monuments of stone or conquests of land, but inventions of the mind, elegant in design, revolutionary in effect. They are known as the 4 great inventions: paper, printing, gunpowder, compass, each one born not of wealth or war, but of curiosity, a desire to record, to replicate, to explore, and yes, sometimes to destroy. Let us begin with the most silent of revolutions: paper. Before paper, the Chinese wrote on bamboo slips, bound with cords into scrolls, heavy, bulky, and expensive. Others used silk, delicate and costly. Writing, and therefore memory, was confined to the elite. But in the year 105 CE, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, a eunuch named Kai Lun changed that forever. He refined the process using mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and fishnets, mashed into pulp and dried into thin, light sheets. Paper was born, cheap, abundant, flexible. It democratized knowledge. With paper, the written word spread like wildfire. Officials documented laws. Poets composed verses. Scholars debated philosophy. And over time, education moved from the halls of privilege into the hands of the many. China had built a vessel not of ships or wheels, but of thought itself. And soon, they would discover a way to replicate it. Printing was not invented in one night. For centuries, the Chinese had carved entire pages of text onto wooden blocks. Woodblock printing, painstaking but powerful. By the Tang Dynasty, Buddhist sutras, calendars, and classics were mass-produced. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, is the world's oldest known printed book with a precise date, a testament to both faith and technology. But the true leap came with the Song Dynasty and a man named Bi Sheng. In the 11th century, Bi Sheng invented movable type printing using individual ceramic characters that could be arranged and rearranged on an iron plate. Faster, cheaper, adaptable. Though complex Chinese characters made widespread use difficult, the concept would eventually travel westward to spark the Gutenberg Revolution in Europe centuries later. But China had lit the flame first, crafting the world's earliest printing press, not for profit, but for preserving civilization. Yet even as China recorded knowledge, it also discovered something explosive. Literally, during the Tang Dynasty, alchemists searching for the elixir of immortality stumbled upon a terrifying mixture: saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. They called it Huo Yao, fire medicine. We know it today as gunpowder. At first, it was used in rituals and fireworks, brilliant bursts to please the heavens. But soon, its military potential was undeniable. By the Song Dynasty, gunpowder-powered flamethrowers, fire arrows, bombs, and primitive cannons. The Chinese developed thunder crash bombs, terrifying grenades hurled over castle walls. For the first time in history, warfare had fire at its fingertips. And like the other inventions, gunpowder too would travel, carried along the Silk Roads through Mongol invasions, eventually reaching the Middle East and Europe. The age of gunpowder empires was born. Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, Europeans, all reshaping war with the spark of Chinese alchemy. China had not sought destruction, but had unveiled a force that reshaped empires. And then there was the compass, a tool so simple, yet so profound. Long before European navigators crossed the Atlantic, the Chinese had discovered that a magnetized needle, floating in water or mounted on a card, always pointed north. As early as the Han Dynasty, lodestone was known to align with Earth's magnetic field. By the Song Dynasty, the compass had become a staple for navigation, not just on land, but at sea. With it, Chinese sailors could venture far from the coast, map new territories, and open maritime trade routes. The compass helped guide mighty fleets across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean, paving the way for later voyages like those of Zheng He. But its influence didn't end in China. The compass would cross continents and spark the age of exploration, allowing Europeans to navigate uncharted oceans, connect continents, and eventually redraw the map of the world. China had given humanity a sense of direction, literally and metaphorically. Paper, printing, gunpowder, compass, 4 inventions, seemingly unrelated, yet together they formed the backbone of the modern world. Paper preserved knowledge, printing multiplied it, gunpowder altered the balance of power, the compass revealed the horizon. These were not accidents. They were born of a civilization that valued learning, curiosity, engineering, and balance with nature. And while these inventions would eventually empower other nations, sometimes against China itself, their origin remains a testament to the brilliance of Chinese minds over millennia. Today, the 4 great inventions are taught in schools, honored in museums, and revered in historical memory, not because they belonged to one empire, but because they belong to all of us now. They remind us that the greatest legacies of a civilization are not its battles, but its ideas, and that long before the modern world took shape, in the workshops of scholars, monks, and alchemists, China had already imagined it. For centuries, the rhythm of China had been one of rise and fall, dynasties blooming like spring and fading like autumn. Each claimed the mandate of heaven, that sacred trust between the ruler and the divine. But when rulers grew corrupt or weak, heaven would turn away. Famine, rebellion, foreign invasion. These were not accidents. They were warnings. And as the Song dynasty faltered, those warnings became deafening. The once great Song Empire had achieved remarkable things. Explosive growth in trade, technology, and urban culture. But prosperity came at a price. The Song emperors struggled to maintain military strength. Northern nomadic tribes grew bold, the borders frayed from the steppes beyond the Great Wall. A new force emerged, fast as lightning, fierce as fire, unified like never before. The world would come to know them as the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan, a once orphaned warrior who united the fractured tribes of Mongolia. The Mongols were not just raiders, they were empire builders. Their cavalry was unmatched, their tactics mobile, ruthless, disciplined, shattered armies across Asia. In 1211, the Mongols invaded northern China. By 1234, they had crushed the Jin Dynasty, which had controlled much of the north. The southern Song resisted valiantly, but it was only a matter of time. Then came Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, a ruler of both sword and vision. He completed the conquest. In 1279, the last Song stronghold fell. For the first time in history, all of China was under foreign rule. Kublai did not destroy China. He ruled it. He declared himself emperor and founded the Yuan Dynasty. He moved the capital to Dadu, present-day Beijing, and adopted many Chinese customs. The Mongols became emperors, and the Chinese became subjects of the steppe. At first, the Yuan dynasty was a marvel. Under Mongol rule, the empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. Silk Road trade flourished. Foreigners came in droves: merchants, monks, emissaries. The most famous of them was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler who described China as a land of wonders efficiency, and immense wealth. The Yuan opened China to the world in ways never seen before. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Mongols remained outsiders. They placed themselves above the native Chinese, both politically and socially. Han officials were sidelined. Heavy taxes drained the countryside. Natural disasters struck. Floods, droughts, plagues, famines grew. The court became decadent. The dynasty detached. And when heaven turns away, rebellion rises. By the early 14th century, uprisings broke out across the empire. Among them was a secret society known as the Red Turbans, inspired by a blend of Buddhism, millenarian belief, and hunger for justice. From the chaos emerged a poor peasant turned monk turned general, Zhu Yuanzhang, orphaned by famine, raised in a monastery. He rose through rebellion with unmatched discipline and charisma. In 1368, his forces seized Dadu. The Mongols fled back to the steppes. The Yuan dynasty was over. Zhu declared a new era, the birth of the Ming dynasty, and with it, China was Chinese once more. The Ming did not simply restore order, they restored dignity. Under Zhu Yuanzhang, now Emperor Hongwu, the Ming rebuilt China from the ashes. Agriculture was revived, granaries restocked, irrigation restored. The civil service examination system, once neglected, was reinstated, a return to Confucian meritocracy. The bureaucracy was centralized. Local corruption was purged. Even the law codes were rewritten to reflect moral clarity and imperial justice. But Emperor Hongwu was also paranoid. Haunted by betrayal, he unleashed a reign of terror in his later years, purging officials, executing thousands. His son, the Yongle Emperor, would later shift the capital to Beijing and begin the construction of the Forbidden City, a symbol of imperial majesty and cosmic order. The Ming believed China was once again the center of the world, and they would prove it. In the early 1400s, the emperor launched a series of breathtaking maritime expeditions led by the great admiral Zheng He, a towering Muslim eunuch from Yunnan, commanding enormous treasure fleets, some ships over 100 meters long. Zheng He sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and East Africa. His missions were diplomatic, not colonial. He brought silk, porcelain, and imperial gifts, and returned with giraffes, spices, and tribute. China had entered the global stage, not through conquest, but through awe. Yet these voyages would not last. Court factions argued the cost was too high. Confucian officials saw them as extravagant. After Zheng He's death, the Ming turned inward. The ships were dismantled, the shipyards closed. The ocean, once a road, became a boundary once more. But the legacy was clear. China had fractured under foreign rule, but risen through resilience. The Ming represented a revival, not just of dynasty, but of identity, cultural, political, spiritual. They reaffirmed the ancient rhythm that even when the mandate is lost, it can be restored. Even when the center collapses, it can be rebuilt. The Forbidden City still stands. The Great Wall was expanded. The canals flowed again. And in every village, every scholar's desk, every ancestor's shrine. The pulse of China beat on. The Mongols had come like thunder and vanished like smoke. But the Chinese people had endured, because empires can fall, borders can shift, but a civilization rooted in memory, virtue, and renewal that survives. By the dawn of the 17th century, China stood tall, proud, ancient, refined. The Ming Dynasty had ruled for nearly 300 years, a symbol of Chinese cultural identity and sovereign strength. But beneath the silken robes of the empire, cracks had begun to form. Natural disasters ravaged the land. Famine spread. Corruption festered. Peasant uprisings erupted like sparks in dry grass. The mandate of heaven, once solid as stone, began to shift, and from beyond the Great Wall, another power stirred. Not Han, not Ming, but Manchu. In 1644, a rebel army captured Beijing. The Ming Emperor hung himself in the palace garden. In desperation, Ming generals opened the gates to a foreign force, the Manchus, to drive out the rebels. But once inside, the Manchus stayed. Thus began the rule of the Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China. The Manchus, though outsiders, were no strangers to governance. They preserved many Chinese institutions, embraced Confucian statecraft, and maintained the imperial bureaucracy. But they also imposed their own culture, requiring Han men to wear the queue, a braided hairstyle symbolizing loyalty to Qing rule. And yet, the early Qing emperors were among China's most capable. Kangxi, the longest reigning emperor in Chinese history, ascended the throne at just 7 years old. By the time he came of age, he had mastered not just military command, but diplomacy, philosophy, and astronomy. He subdued rebellions, stabilized the empire, and welcomed Jesuit scholars to his court, men who brought with them Western knowledge of mathematics, cartography, and science. His grandson, Qianlong, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent. Under his rule, China absorbed Tibet, Xinjiang, and parts of Central Asia. He presided over a golden age of art, poetry, and administration. China, in the 18th century, was not just a kingdom, it was a civilizational giant. But Qianlong too grew old. The empire swelled beyond its ability to control. Bureaucracy bloated, corruption returned, and beyond China's borders, the world was changing fast. The winds of the West were blowing, and they would not be ignored. For centuries, China had seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the axis of civilization surrounded by barbarians. Foreign merchants were allowed in, but only at the edges. Trade was heavily regulated. Tribute was expected. But Europe, now driven by industrial revolutions and colonial ambition, saw things differently. In 1793, Britain sent Lord Macartney to the Qing court to request expanded trade, diplomatic equality, and the opening of ports. Macartney refused to perform the kowtow, the traditional act of prostration before the emperor. Qianlong, unmoved, famously responded, "We possess all things. I set no value on strange or ingenious objects. Our celestial empire has no need of your manufactures. To China, it was diplomacy. To Britain, it was rejection. And rejection would soon turn to conflict. The British had found a commodity the Chinese wanted: opium. Grown in India, trafficked into China, it became a silent weapon. Addiction spread like rot. Silver flowed out of China to pay for the drug, destabilizing the economy. Alarmed, the Qing court acted. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton. Britain retaliated with warships. Thus began the First Opium War. China, despite its vast population and proud history, was militarily outmatched. Steam-powered ships, modern artillery, disciplined troops, the tools of an industrial West, shattered the pride of an agrarian empire. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, ceding Hong Kong to Britain, opening 5 treaty ports, and granting extraterritorial rights to foreigners. It was the beginning of what the Chinese would call the Century of Humiliation. More blows followed. The Second Opium War, the burning of the Summer Palace, the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil wars in history, and the Boxer Rebellion, a desperate uprising against foreign domination. Crushed by an international coalition, the Qing court, once imperial and supreme, was now paralyzed. Foreign powers carved out spheres of influence, exploiting resources and people. Railways, banks, industries, all fell under foreign control. China's ancient confidence had turned to crisis, and yet, amid the sorrow, there stirred awakening. Reformers called for change. Kang Yue and Liang Qichao sought to modernize the state, blend Confucian ideals with Western institutions. Young intellectuals studied in Japan, Europe, and America. A generation was rising, no longer content with emperors and eunuchs, but dreaming of republics, industry, and liberty. Even within the Qing court, Empress Dowager Cixi, long seen as a conservative force, began late attempts at modernization, military reform, new schools, railways. But it was too little, too late. The world had changed, and China had to change with it. In 1911, revolution came, led by Sun Yat-sen and the Tongmenghui. The Qing Dynasty was overthrown. The last emperor, Puyi, a child, was forced to abdicate. Over 2,000 years of imperial rule had come to an end. China was now a republic, scarred, divided, and searching for its soul. The Qing Dynasty, though foreign in origin, had tried to preserve a world that was slipping away, a world of ordered hierarchy, ancestral wisdom, and celestial authority. But the winds of innovation, science, capitalism, and nationalism had blown down every wall. And yet, China did not disappear. It adapted. It remembered. And as it moved into the modern age, it carried with it not just the wounds of defeat, but the memory of greatness. The roads may have changed, but the river of civilization still flowed. History does not vanish. It lingers in words, in cities, in minds. In China, the past is not distant. It breathes beside the present. The emperors are gone. The dynasties have crumbled. But the ideas, the soul of a civilization, remain. This is the story not of an ending, but of a continuum. For over 2,000 years, China was governed by the idea of the mandate of heaven, that rulers must earn their place, not by conquest alone, but by virtue, harmony, and justice. Though no emperor sits on the dragon throne today, the concept survives in new forms. Legitimacy still matters. Stability remains sacred. The state is still the guardian of order, and the people still look to their leaders with the same ancient expectation. Will you protect the balance? In today's China, skyscrapers rise where palaces once stood. Bullet trains fly where horses once galloped. Satellites orbit above the Great Wall. But beneath the steel and glass lies a deep cultural memory, older than Rome, older than the West, still shaping the nation's identity. The language, spoken by over 1 billion people, still uses characters derived from the brushstrokes of the Shang and Zhou. In every school, children still memorize the words of Confucius, whose thoughts outlived empires. Virtue is not left to stand alone, he said. It is sure to attract neighbors. From government to family life, Confucian ideals endure. Respect for elders, filial piety, social duty, education as moral elevation. These are not just historical values. They are present-day principles. Walk into a modern Chinese household, and you'll still find offerings to ancestors, altars to harmony, meals that begin with gratitude, echoes of rituals practiced for millennia. China's ancient contributions continue to shape the world. Paper and printing made mass literacy possible. Gunpowder redefined conflict and power. The compass connected oceans and continents. Traditional Chinese medicine, rooted in Taoist balance and centuries of observation, is studied alongside Western pharmaceuticals. Feng Shui, acupuncture, Tai Chi, and calligraphy are practiced from Shanghai to San Francisco. What began in courtrooms and monasteries now spans global classrooms and laboratories. But the greatest echo of ancient China is not in the inventions themselves. It's in the way China sees time. In the West, time is often linear. Progress, forward motion, revolutions. In Chinese thought, time is cyclical, a wheel, a rhythm, a great tide. Dynasties rise, fall, and rise again. Chaos gives way to order. Winter always ends, but spring always returns. This worldview teaches patience, resilience, and strategic long-term vision, qualities that still define China's posture on the global stage. Where others rush, China often waits. Where others build for the moment, China builds for the century. Today, the People's Republic of China is not an empire, but it is an inheritor of Qin's centralization, Han's civil service, Tang's cultural brilliance, Song's innovation, Ming's pride, and Qing's complexity. Its cities shine with the glow of 5G and AI, but its logic systems still bear the fingerprints of Confucius and Laozi. It launches spacecraft to the moon, yet consults astronomical calendars thousands of years old. It designs smart cities with Confucian ideals of order and balance in mind. Even in the age of algorithms and robotics, there is an enduring belief in harmony, not just with nature, but within society and within the self. In the 21st century, China walks a tightrope between tradition and transformation. It seeks modernity without amnesia. It desires power without losing face. It aims to lead globally, even as it looks inward, listening to the heartbeat of a civilization that once named itself Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, not out of arrogance, but out of belief that it sat at the center of all things. Perhaps, in some ways, it still does. The past is not a burden. In China, it is a compass, guiding decisions, framing identity, offering continuity in a world spinning ever faster. From the oracle bones to blockchain, from bamboo slips to quantum code, the river of civilization flows on. And as we look to the future, one truth remains. China is not merely a country. It is a story told across millennia, still being written, still unfolding. And we, all of us, are now part of its next chapter.